Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Eliani Valijuro, the Global Hub Director of Future Earth in Canada and the Executive Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age. I want to take a moment to extend a warm welcome to you all and thank you for attending this session on the landscape analysis as part of our half-day symposium called Canada's Sustainable Future, Creating a Digital Action Plan. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which I gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future. We respect our continued connections and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the community. On this panel, we will explore the opportunities and challenges of using digital technologies to scale up nature-based solutions equitably while working together with Indigenous peoples and local communities. Before we start, I want to pass it on to our great panelists so they can introduce themselves. So let's see. I'll start with Angela. You're the closest to me.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Angela Cross. I'm currently an assistant professor at Concordia University at the Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment. In my research, I use GIS and remote sensing in combination with ground measurements and models to answer questions related to vegetation development, ecosystem processes, and land use change in response to anthropogenic and natural events such as agriculture, mining, and climate change. I'm interested in all terrestrial ecosystems, but in my work, I have focused a lot on peatlands, forests, and agriculture, and which kind of has given me the interest also to participate in this. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Angela. Damon?
Hi, my name is Damon Matthews. I'm also a professor at Concordia University in the Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment. I come to this topic from the perspective of climate science and climate modeling. I've been working for many years using climate models as a tool to understand emissions pathways and emissions allowances for meeting different global climate targets. And so the entry point of this discussion for me really comes from the recent focus on net zero targets as a way of achieving global climate goals. And as soon as you start talking about net zero as opposed to actual zero, that implies some kind of processes that are actively removing carbon from the atmosphere. And using natural systems to do that is of course the focus of this conversation and could potentially contribute. But there's a lot of caveats there from both a climate side and a social side. So I'm happy to contribute to this conversation, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Damon. Paul Del Giorgio.
Yes, hello. My name is Paul Del Giorgio. I'm in the Department of Biology at the Université de Quebec in Montreal. I work in the ecology and the biogeochemistry of lakes and rivers or inland waters in general. I'm interested in carbon and the movement of carbon in these inland waters. And in particular, we are interested in, among other things, in greenhouse gas dynamics in these lakes and rivers in our landscape. This is partly what brings me here, because although these are not human generated greenhouse gas emissions, they are part of the budget of these budgets that we are talking about here, the natural carbon sinks and sources. So this is what we work on, and we are also particularly interested in the links that exist between land and water and atmosphere. These elements of the landscape are connected, and these carbon sources and sinks are connected, and perhaps we might be discussing this a little bit later on during our panel discussions today. So it's a pleasure to be here with the audience and with my fellow panelists today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. David Relnick?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is David Rolnick. I'm an assistant professor of computer science and Canada's C4 AI chair at McGill University and the Mila Quebec AI Institute. My research group focuses on machine learning and AI tools applied to climate change very broadly, encompassing mitigation, adaptation, and climate science. So a lot of different projects from optimizing electrical grids to surveying and monitoring biodiversity. I'm also one of the co-founders and chairs of Climate Change AI, which is a facilitating organization, international nonprofit that works to catalyze impactful work at the intersection of machine learning, AI, and climate change. And along with Damon, I'm also one of the scientific co-directors of sustainability in the digital age. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, David. Marie-Josée Fortin.
Good afternoon. I'm Marie-Josée Fortin. I'm a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto. I'm known for my expertise in spatial analysis and lately in the monitoring of ecosystem services across Canada. Specifically, my own research, I'm developing technology, methods, tools to assess animal movement, to see the amount of biodiversity and how they are affected by land use change and climate change. And also, I'm not system specific. I had research in terrestrial setting. I have research in the past on wetland as well, peatlands. I have research in marine ecosystem and the lake as well. So basically, I'm interested in the question and how the technology can help us to better maintain species and the processes that make the planet viable for all of us. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Marie-Josée. So Graham Reed.
Yeah, Miigwech, Anin Bojo, Graham Reed, Anishinaabe, Ottawa, Nonjaba, Anishinaabe, and Dao. It's an honor to join this virtual circle from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, and want to acknowledge, my role as an uninvited guest on this territory, and really, share those practices of respect, reciprocity, and walking gently as foundational to, for example, the conversation that we're having today about land and nature-based solutions. I joined the circle with two hats, I guess. One is a member of the Assembly of First Nations and the team that works on climate and environmental policy, and a second as a fourth-year PhD student looking at Indigenous perspectives of nature-based solutions. And so, excited to share this space with all of you and excited to have these conversations. Miigwech.
Thank you all. We'll later another panelist that we'll introduce when she comes in around 3 p.m. Eastern time. So I would like to now just give you an overview of the findings of the series of workshops that we've had on the landscape analysis and the main takeaways. To reach the Paris Agreement goals and the 30 by 30 commitment to protect 30% of land by 2030, Canada needs to develop effective, ambitious initiatives that simultaneously guarantee land protection, bestow socioeconomic benefit to its people, and protect current carbon sinks and promote further carbon uptake. Furthermore, there is broader potential to address climate challenge with nature-based solutions and apply artificial intelligence to scale such solutions rapidly. However, to do so equitably and systemically, Canada needs a robust understanding of the complex dynamics of carbon and water flux and how these interact with the other factors required to implement nature-based solutions successfully. Currently, there is no detailed framework, protocol, or map of Canada's current carbon and water modeling landscape for nature-based solutions implementation, hindering evidence-based decision-making for climate action. Before showing how we developed our project, I want to clarify the difference between nature-based solutions and nature-based climate solutions. The latter offers benefits primarily associated with carbon sequestration. Although necessary, they are not ambitious enough to reach our 30 by 30 commitment equitably. On the other hand, Nature-based solutions offer a plethora of positive benefits beyond carbon sequestration that include but are not limited to biodiversity conservation, increasing ecosystem connectivity, provision of economic support, strengthening of cultural traditions, and food security, among others. We started this project exploring how artificial intelligence and other digital technologies could help us scale up nature-based solutions by helping us to better monitor carbon and water monitoring in Canada. However, we realized soon that focusing only on carbon and water would not allow us to unleash the full potential of nature-based solutions. Only technological tools that allow monitoring all the of nature-based solutions will genuinely help leverage it systemically. Although we acknowledge the importance of carbon uptake, and our discussions will cover this critical part towards reaching the Paris Agreement goals, I want to make sure our panel highlights the actual benefits and goals that technology should be used for towards reaching an equitable and decentralized future. To explore these themes, in October, Sustainability in the Digital Age held a series of virtual expert convenings to explore the opportunities and challenges of using artificial intelligence and other digital technologies for scaling up nature-based solutions while engaging Indigenous and local communities. The convenings took place over 3 half-day sessions and engaged over 70 participants from South America, Europe, and North America, with Canadians representing over 75% of the experts. The workshops gathered various actors representing the private sector, science, research communities, industry, Indigenous communities, and nonprofits. Each day explored one of 3 central themes. Day 1 explored the connections of Indigenous worldviews and technology through digital technologies. The second day explored enabling equitable nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation and ecosystem resilience to climate change. The third day focused on leveraging digital technology for innovating, strengthening, and upscaling nature-based solutions. Although we will further explore the outcomes of the 3 workshops throughout this panel, there are 3 main takeaways I will share with you now. First one is locality. Throughout our consultation process, it was clear that the only way Canada can reach 30 by 30 equitably is by building and implementing digital technologies and nature-based solutions in a direct co-creative process with Indigenous peoples and local communities. If possible, these projects should be spearheaded by the communities involved, or at the very least, be fully co-designed and implemented together with local stakeholders. Only by doing so would we create a monitoring artificial intelligence system that develops embedded and responsive solutions to the most pressing questions and aspirations where they are needed. Second, nature-based solutions alone are not enough to reach our goals. We need to pair them up with other actions. They should not be a distraction from reducing our carbon footprint and creating necessary policies that promote environmental conservation and emission reduction. Third, despite having most of the data sets we need to train artificial intelligence to help us better monitor nature-based solutions, there is a lack of data set interoperability. There is no current platform where a stakeholder can overlap maps of carbon storage potential, Human Development Index, water quality, biodiversity, and land ownership, to name a few, to decide where to implement a nature-based solution. Now that I've done this with this quick overview of the project, I want to pass it on to our panelists by asking Damon, David, and Angela first question. So I'm going to first ask Damon and Angela. One of the greatest concerns of using artificial intelligence and remote sensing data for carbon and water monitoring is data validation. FluxNet is the only carbon validation method we have in Canada so far. What are we missing towards an updated data validation framework in Canada? And how can we get support from the public and private sectors around this? Either one wants to start? Angela, Damon?
Okay, I can maybe start. So in terms of the validation data, but also maybe data that would be critical for estimating. I will focus more on carbon because I don't really work with water. So focusing on 2 points. So critical data that we would need in an AI model to estimate carbon, and then the validation of carbon, I think would be 2 points I want to look at. So in my research, I have used some AI models to look at, for example, estimates of biomass yield and carbon exchange in peatlands and crops. And one of the most important variables that came out of my work was were structural variables, so meaning crop height, leaf area index, so structural vegetation characteristics, which can be obtained from, for example, LiDAR data. So both vegetation, but also topography structure that could also be derived from LiDAR data. So that was one of the key important information that was needed for the models. That was for crop biomass and yield and carbon. And then for peatlands, it was mainly precipitation data, so water-related characteristics. So then I kind of, there is a very recent study that came out by a research group from McMaster University together with World Wildlife Fund Canada. I think they presented it last week. Well, they presented it at the COP27. And so they kind of created a Canadian carbon map, and they also looked at the key important variables for looking at carbon, estimating carbon. And what they found is that for forest biomass, it was basically structural variables, so plant height, the height of the plants, that was found key for the models. And then for soil carbon and peatlands, it was mainly climate variables and soil depth. So I think one of the first things related to, I think the question is also related to commitment from, let's say, the government or provincial agencies, would be maybe to commit to collecting LiDAR data that would allow us to get structural information. There are initiatives going on at provincial level, but not really coordinated at a federal level. So there are independent activities going on. So Quebec has a few LiDAR images that is being led by, I think, Forest Inventory. And Ontario has some, but not, I think it's not a Canadian-wide initiative. And the second thing would be soil data, so soil depth data, to have access to them. With regard to validation, then I would say the FluxNet Canada is one of the data sets that I have used. It wasn't an extensive, like spatially distributed network, but very, and time-wise, it was continuous temporally. So that provided really a good way to validate models, to develop and validate carbon models. And so that is gone. So I think one maybe suggestion for commitment would be to see how to reinstate this program or expand it if to support validation. Another point for validation would be, and it is based on this map that came out, the new map that was presented last week, would be to increase communication between like provinces, organizations in Canada. So they use forest biomass data, so above ground biomass data from the forest inventory. What is it called? NF. Okay, I lost the name. It's the Forest Inventory Organization in Canada, National Forest Inventory. And so they use data from there. The data sets there they are not that recent. I think they have up till 2019. And one of the points that he brought up is that many of the provinces had the data available, but some of the provinces provided coordinates that were rounded. And just because they were rounded, it set the accuracy of the points to within 10 kilometers, but made it useless for use with remote sensing data. So it would be just standardization and a minimum already for the location, but then also the methods. I'm not sure if the methods are standardized. Actually, I didn't find that information. So that would be for biomass, forest biomass information, carbon, and then the soil information, which is the soil database that I used was a global soil database, and it was actually, it's not a recent database. For Canada, actually, the data goes from 1978 to 1998, so it's not that recent as well. And soil depth was kind of considered one of the key information points for the model. But that model, the data set also provides soil organic carbon. I think those would be my key points. Did I pass my time?
Thank you very much, Angela. Damon?
I mean, that was a pretty good answer to the question. I don't have a huge amount to add. I mean, I think one kind of high level comment is that, FluxNet data, there's a big difference between carbon flux data and carbon stock data. So, and, depending on what you're interested in measuring, the flux data, which is what FluxNet aimed to provide, will tell you how much carbon is being exchanged with the landscape. It won't tell you how much is there, or how that carbon stock changes in response to disturbances. And so, young, fast-growing forests might have a very high carbon uptake that you would see reflected in the FluxNet data, but could have a very low carbon storage associated with that. Whereas an older, more mature forest or an old growth forest, probably has a very small net carbon flux, but a very large total carbon stock. And so that distinction, I think, is actually really important for the questions around nature-based solutions, because we don't want to be converting old forests that have a huge amount of carbon stored in them to young forests that are growing very fast and taking carbon out of the atmosphere. That would be a perverse interpretation of a nature-based solution. And so I think choosing the data that matches the objective is very, very important.
Thank you, Damon. So I'm going to pass on to David Relnick. So David, how can governmental policy facilitate the use of intelligence in climate action?
Thank you for the question. So this is a huge space, and I should caveat first by saying that I am an AI researcher. I am not a policy researcher, and I'm certainly not a policy maker. I can talk through some of the advice that we recently provided as part of a global partnership on AI report released last week at COP26, recommending how governments can facilitate the responsible use of AI within climate action. It can highlight some aspects that may be particularly relevant for this particular panel discussion. And before diving into recommendations, a lot of these are relevant outside of the realm of nature-based solutions. There are a lot of ways that AI can be relevant within climate action, across mitigation and adaptation, as well as climate science, not just in monitoring and distilling unstructured data into usable information, which is often sort of the role that AI is playing in the context of nature-based solutions and land. Often that is the role that AI is playing, but AI can also play roles in optimizing complicated systems. For example, if one's looking at mitigation, one can think about AI optimizing the heating and cooling system inside a building or industrial processes. AI can be really useful in forecasting, like forecasting supply and demand to balance electrical grids, or predicting crop yield for food security. And then AI can also advance the scientific modeling and experimentation process by speeding up physical models in certain cases, or by providing suggestions of what experiments to do, for example, for accelerated materials discovery. But those are mostly not relevant for today's panel. Looking at the overall headings for how governments can advance meaningful work in this area, some of the headings that we see are in data and digital infrastructure, in research and innovation funding, in deployment and systems integration, in capacity building, and then cross-cutting in international collaborations. Maybe let's deal with each of those individually. In the data and digital infrastructure space, I think this will come up very frequently throughout the panel discussion, and as Angela already described in detail, there's a huge need not just for more data, but for data standards, and for standards for structuring data, formatting data, sharing data. These are all aspects where coordination is really key. Some of the things that we recommend are the establishment of data task forces in climate critical sectors, facilitating data creation and open data standards where it's appropriate in climate critical industries and areas. Because often data exists, but is held by certain players, and there aren't necessarily the incentive structures or the standards for sharing that, even if it's for the benefit ultimately of all players. Creating data portals to increase data access and sharing. Creating a catalog, an inventory of where data lives in different areas, and I know that that's done in various specific sectors, but really a lot of data that exists is very hard for people to find. In some cases, overseeing the collection of data itself, and data collection systems can, in some cases, be something that policymakers should intervene with. And then something that's related to the question of digital infrastructure, ensuring that appropriate resources in data and also in computation are available to academic researchers, to civil society, and also to like small and medium enterprises to increase the equity of access to data and access to compute, which is often something that can perpetuate a digital divide otherwise. So this is in the space of data and digital infrastructure. Turning to the space of funding, really thinking about how often there's funding for AI and there's funding for climate relevant action, but those don't necessarily intersect, and ensuring that in the first place, if there is the capacity to direct AI funding based upon impact, as measured by climate impact and various other forms of societal impact, really having impact-driven funding. In some cases, accommodating AI where relevant within wider grand challenges in climate change, and in some cases, particular targeted challenges where AI can be particularly high impact. Thinking about open IP, open data, and open model development standards for funding, and various considerations regarding how funding is being distributed to ensure a better equity of the players and the problem definitions, because often who is defining the problems is extremely inequitable. In deployment and systems integration, we see a need for embedding AI and digitalization experts in many cases into policy teams and advisor groups, and setting up cross-sectoral conversations and innovation centers. The need for collaboration is key here, bringing the relevant communities together. So in some cases that will be multi-sector innovation centers. In some cases that will be innovation pathways within existing industries and existing players. And then in terms of incentive structures, thinking about non-commercial public interest applications, a good example being something like Climate Trace, which is a coalition of entities that have come together to monitor greenhouse gas emissions. And these are not necessarily aligned with normal commercial incentives. And this was started, therefore, by philanthropic funding. So ensuring that this kind of really essential carbon inventory or greenhouse gas emissions inventory work is being incentivized and given the tools necessary to succeed. And then in capacity building, really thinking about, in some cases, increasing AI literacy and upskilling programs for sectors and industries where there isn't necessarily that kind of expertise where it's relevant. For smaller players, it may be relevant to think about secondment programs to bring AI experts there, or to create external AI solutions providers that are really, or AI for climate solutions providers that are able to provide that sort of AI and digitalization support for such entities. And then finally, in terms of international collaboration, really thinking about knowledge sharing between countries and data sharing between countries as well. Oftentimes there's a huge advantage, not just in sharing knowledge and expertise, but also for AI models, it's essential to have as much data as possible and for it to be as general as possible. Maybe Canada and other countries where there is similar data should get together and create data pools within the structure of existing or new international organizations. I can dive into more detail in any of these, but I think I'm at time, so I'll stop there.
Yes, thank you, David. So I'm going to go on to Paul, Marie-José, and Graham. So after our discussions during the landscape analysis project and our work for Indigenous climate action that we did at Sustainability in Digital Age and Future Earth, we have realized that nature-based solutions are only part of the solutions. What other measures need to be coupled with nature-based solutions to actually fulfill Canada's 2030, 2040, and 2050 goals? And based on your work and experience, what factors should we never neglect when implementing nature-based solutions? Who wants to start?
Okay, I will start. I may be having a completely, oops. You hear me? Yeah, okay. Basically, if we want, let's say, to favor the reforestation of some area that been burned, like in BC last summer and Ontario, so we have those regions in Canada that we are fortunate that is a land full of forest, but the forest will be affected by disturbance. Drought is the next disturbance that is coming, insect outbreaks and fires. So we need to have a better vision of reforestation, and we need to start to grow the trees of the futures that are adapted to those different conditions. So host resistance of different insect outbreaks, plants that are resistant to drought, and so on and so forth. Then technology is good and monitoring is good, but then you can monitor forever. You need to have some standard to say, then now this is enough. You know, you said that you will have that much capital, but you are destroying, or the disturbance are destroying the capital that you thought you had. So you need to have a monitoring program that has a way to assess when are you flipping from a resource that was a supply, and that the supply is still present in the landscape. So it's this supply and demand ratio that you need to maintain. So what we need to do is also to realize that it's very easy in Canada to have huge protected areas or huge areas in the north, or even for the marine protected areas. But where the issues are also is along the US-Canada border. And maybe there's more little actions that need to be placed in farmland. So stewardship, to have some kind of hedgerows that will maintain the soil, because that's the problem, is soil erosion. We're not capturing the carbon in the soil anymore because there's a lot of wind and the soil are dispersed. So a little aspect of landscape configuration of the feature of the forest, of the agriculture farms, can help to maintain the health of people where people live. Also, is not in the great north that we live close to the border, we live in cities. So we need to have action more locally, and the heat wave that we see in cities, if we were planting more trees, we could also minimize the temperature. So there's a lot of aspect of local action that can be good, but often with LiDAR, maybe this information could be capped. but it's very fine-grained data set that we need. So it's kind of a scaling issue. So we need broad scale, maybe information at the watershed level, and yet we need information at very, very fine resolution. So there's a lot of people in my university, in the geography department, that they are trying to assess the health of forests in urban setting and the age of the trees in the forest and which tree to replace, because soon all the trees that were planted 100 years ago are now decaying and will be cut by cities. So there's a lot of action that needs to be done locally, and we need to do that soon, not waiting 10 years down the road. We need to have action now. Just one thing less, connectivity is a big aspect that people talk a lot. But connectivity, if you have only a little strip of forest, is not sufficient. So you need to take a bigger vision of what connectivity you want to maintain and achieve. I will stop here.
Eliane, can I go next after
Mm-hmm.
Marie-Josée? Yeah, great. Miigwech for the question, and miigwech for all my fellow panelists. I think often we talk about nature-based solutions as this new concept, and I think it's important to kind of challenge that, discovery paradigm that we seem to operate in, policy and other circles. We know that ecosystem-based approaches have occurred sustainably for thousands and thousands of years, and really we're just kind of relearning the harm that unfortunately we have caused and continue to cause to the world around us. And so I think the first thing that in my mind is essential to couple with the concept of nature-based solutions is the ongoing need for rapid decarbonization and the ongoing need to stop harm to the land around us. And we see that, not only within the context of resource development, obviously an important focal point for a lot of different people, but also just, municipal and provincial planning. For example, city planning and land use planning that continues to take approaches that, for example, clear cut, prospective suburban lots. And so really, I think it's important to consider just the broader kind of political and cultural framework in which the concepts of nature-based solutions exist. First, I obviously want to recenter this perspective, but when we talk about, land, waters, and territories, we need to talk about whose lands, waters, and territories we're on. And I think it's important to, envision and conceptualize these solutions as embedded within, that longer term decolonization project that, unfortunately is said in really nice and fluffy ways, but is not always operationalized in, conversations, management, decision-making frameworks, and kind of broader legislative, preventative acts to, the exercise of those activities of decolonization. And so, I find that's an important element, and also just the broader cultural element, right? Which is to say, often we don't take a step back to think about, what are the ontological assumptions that we're entering this conversation on nature-based solutions with. Like, the further instrumentalization of nature seems to perpetuate a model of thinking of domination and supremacy. And I guess it's important in my mind when thinking about these things, we also think about, those cultural and behavioral and social shifts that need to occur to start thinking about, nature, and I use that in the broadest sense, animals, trees, rocks, etc., as our relatives, and as, important components of exercising our responsibilities to the land around us. And, unfortunately, if we don't do that, and if we don't take that step back, we seem to perpetuate these models of thinking that really created this problem to begin with. And to Marie-Josée's point, like I think that point of connectivity is extremely important. And a concrete example of that is the desire to, you know, talk about protected areas and certain components of what we now call as Canada, but continue to uphold practices of, you know, urban sprawl or land use planning in other areas. And really, when thinking about, you know, truly taking a nature-based lens, we need to look at that consistency across landscapes in order to really uphold the principles of, you know, equitable and supportive design that is nature positive, that halts, you know, biodiversity and nature loss, and really at the same time upholds cultural diversity. And so I guess in my mind, you know, what I hope to frame this conversation in for the way in which we fulfill those 2030, 2040, and 2050 targets is really a window in which we can also take a step back and look at the problems that we're attempting to solve, and whether those problems are solely about the reduction of greenhouse gases, or in actuality they're about, you know, understanding the root causes that seem to perpetuate imbalance with nature and with the world around us. And so, you know, through these conversations and through the, you know, insight that all of these experts, and as well as those on the line, bring, you know, we can start to reorient these sorts of tools to address those broader socio-political and cultural frameworks in which they exist. And so I guess I'd stop there and say miigwech.
Thank you, Graham. Paul?
Well, thank you to my colleagues for their insight. I think it lays out everything very nicely. And I perhaps the reflection I would like to make is on the term nature-based solution itself, because sometimes the distinction between things that we do that are part of a problem and things that we do that represent a true solution to a problem is not quite obvious to all of us, in the sense that I give you a very trivial example, a silly example. There is a difference between cutting the forest and planting the forest. Both are embedded in the nature-based solution. You cannot view them as different angles. They are inside of this. You can argue that both represent solutions, in the sense that you can stop cutting the forest, and that represents a solution because it represents ceasing to do something that adds to the problem, whereas planting forests represents an action towards a solution to a problem. Now, this is all quite mixed up, because when do we decide that we need to stop doing something that is adding to the problem, and then that is a path to go, as opposed to deciding that we are going to do actions that actually represent a solution, a novel solution that is implemented through something that we do within the ecosystem context. And the reason I bring this up is because in the bag of nature-based solutions, of course, the concept itself is very attractive, because who's going to think there is anything wrong in trying to fix stuff that is not right, and using nature to so of course I'm an advocate for that. The question is when we start to have lack of clarity as to what is behind this, and also, most importantly, and this is the point I would like to bring to our discussion, lack of realism as to what we can get out of this and how far we can go with this. And this addresses the question that Eliane posed to us, in the sense that, well, how much can we get out of this? Either correcting our actions that add to the problem, or creating actions that represent true solutions to a problem. So, and in the discussion, in the world of nature-based solutions or nature climate solutions, because Eliane posed the contrast between the two, and I do think that there is a contrast, but they both share this basic problem, is that there is the potential for this, and then there is the reality of what can be achieved by this. Because we can stop our actions that are adding to the problem. We can stop cutting the forest. We can stop draining the marshes. We can stop polluting lakes. We can stop a lot of things that we know are adding to the problem. We call that a solution. It's in the bag of our solutions. And then there's also a whole other set of things which we also call solution, which is, well, we're going to plant trees as well. And we are going to create wetlands where there were none. And we are going to stabilize the soils. And we call that solutions as well. They're not the same. They're very different. We are going to create, we're going to manage soils in a way, we're going to manage agriculture in novel ways. But that's not the same as saying we are going to stop cutting the forest, because we are going to change our ways of, these are very different ways of, these are not the same solutions. In fact, some of them are not even solutions. They are fake solutions, in the sense that saying that we're going to stop doing something. Well, they're not fake solutions, but they are, they have different timeframes, they have different consequences, they have different accounting. And I just wanted to put this on the table because there's, this is not my area of expertise in any way. But I have been, because of this panel that we're in, and because it's a topic that I think is so important, doing some reading and some discussing about this. And I find that, of course, it's a very, very important topic, but it's one that it's permeated by a lot of ambiguity and a lot of lack of, I think, realism, and a lot of expectations that are not met. And this is, I think this is something that can backfire to an approach that is fundamentally very sound and very, very important. So I just wanted to put that on the table. And the other thing that I want to paraphrase what my colleague said previously, that whatever is done, we have to remember that the ecosystem doesn't function, the landscape doesn't function in parcels. In other words, it's not like you move a knob here and the forest is going to do one thing, and then the wetland is going to do another thing, and that you can fix the wetland and then do something to the forest or do something to the river. It doesn't work that way. The landscape functions as a unit. You move a knob here in the forest or in the upstream, and something moves downstream or something moves in the coast. So what to answer the second of Eliane's question, what is it, where should we be moving towards in this nature-based approach of trying to address issues? In my perspective, we need to have a landscape perspective where we try to think of it as not moving a knob in the forest and see what happens there. We try to capture carbon in the forest and then we forget about everything else, because this doesn't actually work very well, because you might be increasing your capture in the forest, but it might be escaping somewhere else. And we know actually that is the case. So I think we need to be moving towards a more of a landscape perspective where we look at the whole landscape and see what the landscape is actually doing or not doing, and where there are solutions, including the people living there.
Thank you very much. That was, it's such an important element around clarifying what is real and what is fictional, and how people have trouble understanding what really needs to be done in this space. So I know Marie-Josée has to leave at 3, so I will ask Marie-Josée to be the first to answer the following question that I am posing to everybody on the panel. If we were to develop and implement a protocol for using digital technologies to monitor nature-based solutions equitably, what is one thing we must absolutely include in this protocol? And could you explain why, briefly? Marie-Josée?
First, I just want to echo what Paul just said. The management at an ecosystem level, so landscape, he said, but a watershed unit where you have this kind of what happened at the headwater influence what is at the bottom of the slope, and integration from terrestrial to aquatic system, freshwater is important. Well, what can we do is my research is also about ecotones or transition. So we are good to say what is in the center of the forest, center of the lake, but the things where there's exchange of carbon or fluctuation, and most biodiversity is at the transition. So the ecotones, the transition, the edge effects. So we have fragmented our landscape a lot. And now maybe we're just left with little strip of forest, a little strip of riparian zone. So how to monitor that that strip is still providing the nature solutions that we hope to have is crucial. So basically, I think monitoring the actual biodiversity that live in such region, and that's another completely budget and amount of money that the technology cannot do. The technology nowadays with airbones that are more like little drones can give you a better assessment of the species diversity of plants, but we are missing a lot of information. So we should not just say, oh, we have data, and the data is not sufficient. We need action. Like Paul was saying, we need to know what to do to implement the rhythm of nature. Nature is not overnight. Several processes, peatlands, wetlands take a long period of time to accumulate the carbon that we want to store. So that's what we need to be able to do. And don't rely on large regions of the country to have your solution met. You need to think of where people are living, and try as kind of small scale action could help quite a bit in where the pollution is, where the emission of carbon is by car and air pollution. So you need to have action in the cities and around the cities. So there's so much to do. But we need to be positive and do things, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Josée. Would anybody else like to contribute to this? Please, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I could jump in. I mean, a couple of reactions to what Paul and Graham and some others said as well. I mean, to answer the question, I mean, the one thing I would say is that nature-based solutions are not a substitute for decarbonization, and this is something that Graham pointed out in his opening remarks. And this is a danger, and that especially in Canada, we're trying to achieve a net zero target for carbon emissions. There's a temptation to point to the huge land base we have as something that can help us achieve that. There's at best the ability of natural systems to take carbon out of the atmosphere is marginal. I mean, obviously there's a large pool of carbon, there's a large exchange, but actually shift that towards a stronger carbon sink on purpose is a gigantic endeavor. I think there are lots of reasons to embark on nature-based solutions. There are lots of potential benefits that could be realized, and carbon is likely one of them, but it's probably not the most important. And if we trade off fossil fuel emissions reductions for net natural carbon storage, we're not going to benefit the climate likely. And those carbon storages could also be temporary, and if that's the case, then the long-term climate warming would actually be larger than it otherwise would have been. So there is a danger of using solutions as as an offset. It's not an offset, and it should not be construed as an offset. Paul mentioned the idea of fake solutions, and I would say that there are fake solutions that are being called nature-based solutions right now, and usually when that's being done, it's it's in the use of rebranding business as usual extractive activities as a nature-based solution. And replanting a forest that you just cut down is not a nature-based solution. That's best practices. That is the current status quo. So in order to be a solution, it needs to be a new way of interacting with the land, and a new understanding of our position in the landscape. And one of the, I think, fundamental challenges, this panel is supposed to be about using AI and other advanced technologies to support the implementation of nature-based solutions. But I don't think we agree really on what the objectives of those solutions should be. And there's a wide range of potential objectives, ranging from supporting the business as usual and calling it a solution, to actually redefining our relationship with the land and ecosystems, and allowing land that has previously been damaged to regenerate and heal. I mean, those would be nature-based solutions that would contribute both to climate mitigation and also to ecosystem integrity and community welfare. And so this kind of distinction between competing goals, I think, is a really important underlying challenge, before we can even get to correct implementation of the technologies that are at our disposal.
Thank you, Damon. Anybody else? Go ahead, David. Go ahead, David.
I agree completely with what Damon and the previous panelists said, and maybe following up on what Damon said about let's not get too excited about nature-based solutions. Let's not get too excited about technology either. Technology is not going to magically come in and save us, and it's not generally going to create wholly new avenues for action here. In many cases, I mean, speaking as an AI researcher and practitioner, AI is generally not helpful at all. It's generally not applicable. In certain cases it is, but that's only if you've really carefully scoped the problem and made sure that it is something where your techniques are useful, and then generally very simple techniques are the most useful. It's very easy to get into tech washing, where fancy technologies, especially new technologies that sound really powerful like AI, can be seen as almost a way to enable wholly new paradigms of action, and generally that's not the case. Generally there are some existing bottlenecks that people have identified, and sometimes the AI is relevant in helping address some of those, but it's the answer. And then also remembering that technology is often part of the problem. So in many cases, AI is being used to accelerate climate change. Like, it's being used to accelerate oil and gas exploration and extraction very widely. The oil and gas industry is expected to make about $500 billion more in profit by 2025, thanks to AI and analytics. These are all double-edged swords, and they're only useful when you're very careful about them. And I guess the flip side of this, the positive, is collaboration is hugely important. Making sure that the people who are implementing technological tools understand those tools and don't get too excited about them. Making sure that they're also, making sure that people with expertise outside of AI aren't using AI in ways that it's not that's not actually helpful, making sure that people in AI aren't selling the public or policymakers or researchers in another field on a solution that isn't actually needed. Sometimes AI researchers get too excited about how their methods could be used and don't actually think about matching it to problems that really need solving. So thinking about this both ways, collaboration and humility, and not being techno-solutionist.
Thank you, David. Angela, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted maybe to add to what the previous panelists have mentioned, and mainly based on the focus for nature-based solution to make sure that the actions are, that the focus is really on long-term actions, like really long-term sustainability. And maybe one example that I have of something very recent is where I think the Premier of Ontario, who mentioned that they want to develop the Ring of Fire region for resource extraction, for production of electric vehicles. So I mean, electric vehicles are good, but then to get your electric vehicles, you're basically destroying the environment. And so like the long-term vision should be really based on, and also for nature-based solution that, that's really long-term beyond maybe our life, but because there are a lot of short-term decisions that are being made that look very good at a short term, but maybe are not. And then I want to maybe hook into what Graham said about nature-based solution being mentioned as something new while it's not. And I think this group really has at the core of it the communication with indigenous communities, because I think that is really key. Indigenous communities have truly implemented nature-based solutions. So there is a lot that we can learn in terms of looking at long-term nature-based solutions. My point for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Would anybody else like to add?
Yeah, sure. I can add slowly. Or Paul, do you want to go?
No. Please go ahead. I'll
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate all of the contributions that everybody has shared, and really, lift up the I guess the importance of clarifying what are the objectives and what are the definition and what's the way of being, knowing, and thinking that informs those definitions. And I guess, like, in the framing that I introduced, we could argue that all solutions are nature-based, especially when identifying ourselves as a functional component of what we characterize as nature. And so I guess it's important just to kind of situate ourselves in the appropriate position. One thing I think that I'd like to contribute into the circle, and Damon, I think, framed this quite eloquently, is the tendency to identify nature-based solutions as something separate from broader climate-related activity. And I appreciate David's kind of framing of the recognition that we need to scope the problem, and we need to avoid the kind of techno solutionist framing, whether both in the context of AI and technology, but also in the context of the way in which we frame the contributions that nature-based solutions, planting trees, whatever, provides. And then I think Paul did that quite effectively. And so I just want to reiterate those important principles and how we think about and contextualize the role of this conversation in the kind of broader efforts to advance climate justice, advance Indigenous justice, racial justice, gender justice, disability justice, all of which I think are kind of foundational manifestations of the expansion of those root causes, and colonialism being an important component of that. And so I'd say the other thing that I think we should avoid is the perpetuation of another form of climate colonialism. And there's a really interesting scholar down in Michigan, he's Potawatomi, Kyle White, who talks about this concept of colonial deja vu. And essentially, in that characterization, he talks about the massive amount of environmental change that occurred when, European settlers arrived in what we currently call Canada. And we see the massive implications. We also see the present day manifestations of those implications. For example, want to lift up those struggling in Abbotsford and Sumas Lake and all the very real flooding that has occurred, and also is a result of the efforts of men to manipulate landscapes to suit their needs. And so I guess in that context, it's important to avoid that tendency to perpetuate those structures of colonialism, and really kind of reinvest in the opportunities to decolonialize and decolonize our thinking in how we think about both the problems and the problem identification and the appropriate solutions to get to that. So maybe I'd stop there.
Paul, would you like to add anything to this?
Well, yeah, I completely agree with what was said, and perhaps add that I think we need to take the because we are talking about how to implement and what are the risks, and I think we need to take the positive sides of it, and the risks associated to it. And I think that it's a vague term. It's a catch-all. There's risks associated to that. It is like Miriam was saying. If it's brought to the table as a substitute or even as a viable element of decarbonization and so on, then it is not going to work out, because it is not. It's just not going to be like that, because the data actually suggests that it's just not going to work that way. But if it's brought to the table as an approach to deal with current problems, then that is a positive side of it, because it's a way of thinking about the ecosystem, the people who live in it, and ways of correcting harms and ways of dealing with issues in a way that is different than what we have done so far. So I think that's the positive aspect of it that I think we have to collectively push and promote. I think there are risks with it. And for example, one that I would like to put on the table here is the fact that any such thing, especially when, for example, with carbon, and of course, anytime there's any business potential with anything, of course, you run the risk of things being monetized and then going in another direction. And we see that a lot with carbon credits and with efforts to do this. And of course, when things get monetized, then you lose kind of the nature-based thing, which has to be based on science and evidence and ecological principles of what this thing is doing, and then it goes into accounting principles and very creative accounting principles in terms of how much can we get, both the ones buying credits and needing credits and the ones selling the credits, and with absolutely no regard to what the system is actually doing. Okay, then we go into this perverse thing, which is benefiting both parties. Both benefit, but the net for the problem that we wanted to solve is close to zero. Now, this is a very perverse situation where we have the name natural climate or natural based solution, but of course, you might as well take the natural out, and you can put it's almost like a tax exercise, tax reduction exercise. we are in the realm of the financial thing. So there is a very big risk that these things are taken over by other interests and they get out of the realm of the science-based, evidence-based, comparative, consistent, where they're scrutinized, where they're comparable, and so on. And I think this is a very big risk, and it's not just in business. Whole countries are actually manipulating and using these things because there are gaps and because there are uncertainties in how we do the accounting and this and the other and so on. So we have a long way to go with this, but because in the ambiguities of the language and of the concepts and so on still permeate the whole thing. So I think these are some of the risks that we are facing with these approaches, but there are also many opportunities. So I'm personally positive about it.
I think what's really critical is the importance of understanding the risks and figuring out what are the clear opportunities to move forward. And so the following question I'd like to ask, and Graham, I'd like you to start answering this one, is technology is advancing faster than ever before. And so it's providing us with new monitoring and development tools almost daily. However, these technological breakthroughs will never unleash their full potential if local communities cannot use them. What do we need to bestow better access to these tools? How can we generate additional capacities to build these technological tools together with Indigenous and local communities to ensure a co-creative and fully reciprocal process? And what are some good examples of the use of digital innovations in your experience, and what can we learn from there for future implementation?
Yeah, great. And Mikuch, for that, and also for the really important points that everybody brought to the previous question. I think I would start out by challenging the framing of this question slightly, and mostly because I think to David's earlier point, there's a tendency to see technology as a way to solve problems without actually restructuring our conversation on what are the problems and what's needed to solve them. And the unfortunate reality is that often when thinking about Indigenous peoples, we need to first prioritize what are their priorities and what are their needs in the exercise of their self-determination and their revitalization of institutions, for example. And so one thing that I often see, unfortunately, is that process begins after the tools are created, based on, as David more eloquently explained, based on whatever technology of the day. And in our earlier conversations, even about the potential for AI and contributing to carbon modeling, et cetera, we also need things that address the large systemic and structural challenges that Indigenous peoples face in what we currently know as Canada. And technology isn't always the solution to all of those problems, right? We need to address the chronic underfunding of housing and water on reserve. We need to address the ongoing intergenerational legacy of residential schools. We need to address the very real reality of a mental health and suicide crisis that's plaguing our young people. And I'm not always convinced that the technology is the kind of opportunity for those. And that's not to be overly techno-pessimistic. It's more to orient this question on, how do we make sure that we're actually supporting self-determination first and the exercise of those priorities through, and I appreciated Paul's kind of metaphor of, addressing the current wrongs and then thinking about the additional solutions that we need to do. And I see those things as simultaneous, but in these conversations, we often lose sight of those kind of current wrongs that are facing our communities. And if we take it from that perspective, if we take it from a lens of, acknowledging the structural constraints and trauma that continue to persist, we then arrive at a different conversation, and we start that co-creative and reciprocal process at a very different stage, which in my mind is the opportunity presented in these conversations. And part of that, without sounding overly radical, is really about shifting power, and how do we use the respective positions of all of us to help support that power shift in a way that then informs the ability for First Nations or other Indigenous groups to actually build capacity around those things at the kind of core bottom of the of human and societal needs: health and education and fresh water and equitable and affordable access to food, all of which I see as those important kind of investments within capacity. And then of course once those things are addressed, we then get to the space as to how do we use those other tools to address the other plethora of problems or opportunities that are represented in our lands and territories. Now, all that, that was what came across a little bit negative, but the point more that I'm trying to make is, and we heard this earlier, technology is a tool, and that tool needs to be wielded in the way that fully respects the priorities and governance mechanisms of those who use it. And so to really build, in my mind, this process that we're identifying and framing out, we need to first build relationships. And those relationships, as I think Marie-Josée kind of spoke about a little bit, are have to be founded in that mentality of that long-term action and that long-term reciprocal relationship, which in my mind, really talks about how do we walk in this journey together, and how do we think about the solutions that are required that don't necessarily need technology, but then what are the other problems and opportunities presented. And one example that comes to mind that I think has been really effective and has been actually, Inuit led is the app called the Siku app, Siku being an Inuktitut word for ice. And essentially they've worked with a company to design a kind of Facebook equivalent for Inuit harvesters and hunters. And part of what's been able with that technology is also the ability to communicate the conditions of sea ice based on the kind of long history of Inuit knowledge and relationship to the ice, and then communicate that to others. And so I think there are, instances of these Indigenous-led technology tools that help get to that sustainable future, but only if that technology is designed in such a way that it prioritizes the needs of in this circumstance Inuit, and Inuit being out on the land and maintaining their cultural relationship through harvesting or through hunting. And so when talking, I guess in these sorts of forums, and when we're approaching technology as something that's in existence or that's being conceptualized, there are what I consider as kind of minimum standards of protection and articulation of the data requirements and relationship requirements that help inform that equitable and process of walking together. And that's things like OCAP. It's things like the work that was discussed at our landscape modeling session, as well as just those principles affirmed within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I'd be remiss not to say that part of that constellation of the equitable space and ethical space of where do we build relationships needs to be informed also by the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, as well as the calls for justice for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, all of which in my mind are important components of what we're trying to do, and how do we build out that creative and reciprocal process in a way that aligns with Indigenous-led priorities. And so I'd stop there and say miigwech.
Thank you very much Thank you very much, Graham. I'd like to go on now to the next question. And I know, Angela, you have to leave soon, so I'd like you to answer first if you can. If we were able to develop a Canada-specific for nature-based solutions implementation, what are the things we must absolutely include in this framework? And could you please explain briefly why?
Sorry. So one thing to do and one thing to avoid, is that it? Okay.
Yes. So yes. So in terms of what is one thing we should absolutely include in the framework for a Canada-specific nature-based solution framework, and you know, what would you think we need to avoid and why?
So I think one thing we should definitely include, is I think what I mentioned earlier is having, and what many of you have mentioned is the clear objectives and the clear long-term path towards achieving those objectives. And I think it is not maybe totally clear yet, but that has to be, I think, the guiding line for setting up the framework. And but long term, I mean, like, really, that there can be, even for nature-based solution. Like the example I gave was related to development, potential development, which will look green because it's because of the development of the electric cars. But the same way, the same principle, if you look at nature-based solution, there are some solutions that maybe may have short term, that maybe they're actually short term solutions, like replanting trees. It's to feel like I think it's a good uh, initiative, but at the end, I mean, we cannot continue replanting trees, like, eternally. So there has to be something that we have to do to not replant trees, and that involves, I think, more in terms of our relationship with the environment. I think that has to change how we see the environment, and it has to be adopted, at in terms of the coordination, has to be adopted by all levels, so that, the federal towards the provincial and at local communities, that line exists. Because if at a certain level economic benefits at short term are still the driver, which is happening a lot, I think, then there will be a consistent, struggle between pushing for sustainable implementation. So there should be work should be done and kind of getting a line, and so that everyone can understand that certain actions are really, really just short term, if we even if they look good at a long term. And the one thing to avoid, I think, would be to not implement we should not implement the the nature-based solutions without actually it's just a repetition, because I think this is included in the panel and it has been the core of the talk. It's really to really consult with local communities, so indigenous communities and local communities. That should not be, it should be something that should be really part of it, which is part of this here. So, but it has to be something front upward.
Thank you,
I think
Angela.
those are my main thoughts.
I'd like to welcome Verna McGregor. So welcome, Verna. We're happy you were able to get out of the green room and join us. And so I'd just like to take this opportunity to give you some space to introduce yourself and share any remarks that you're holding right now as you're joining us.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy I got into the green room. Yeah, Kwei, everybody, bonjour. I've been thinking a lot about this nature-based and
I think we just lost Verna. Oh, I'm so sorry. While we wait for Verna to come back, Graham, I know you also need to leave soon. So if you'd like to just share any remarks before you leave.
Yeah, I wish Elder Verna was here. She'd be much more eloquent. No, I don't have many things to add. I think this has been a really exciting conversation, and really appreciate all of the contributions that everybody has brought. And really, in my mind, it comes back to the role that nature-based solutions, and I think Paul framed this really well, are not necessarily a solution in themselves, but a way in which we think about, the solutions that are required to advance both decarbonization and decolonization. And in my mind, I think that's the exciting piece if leveraged appropriately, because it really challenges that embedded status quo in the way that we think about the climate crisis and the drivers of that crisis. So really look forward to the continuation of these dialogues, and Chimigwich to everybody, and stay safe, and look forward to seeing you all.
We can't hear you.
Oh, we have. Go ahead, Damon. Were you saying anything? Good. Okay. So just saying that we received a question in the chat on how can consent be managed when data from consenting individuals groups can be used to make inferences about those who did not consent to participation, and when data is used to inform management outside participating communities. Anybody want to tackle this data question?
I don't think anyone has an answer to this. I mean, it's clearly an important question in any line of research, and to some extent, the answer is probably following appropriate ethical protocols when implementing either research or application of knowledge to communities. I mean, I think Graham was talking about, the relationships are really important, and in this case, when we're talking about relationships with the First Nations and or Indigenous communities and other communities that are on the land, it has to start with that, and building those relationships and building that trust, and then following, the rules that are in place to govern how research is done and how data is used.
So hopefully Verna will be able to join us again, but I just want to follow up on what I was mentioning earlier in terms of, if we were to develop a Canada-specific framework for nature-based solution implementation. Angela had started already responding. Does anybody else want to add anything in terms of what are things we must absolutely include in this framework, and explain a little bit why?
I say a couple of things. I mean, I think Indigenous leadership is pretty central and pretty key. Said before by me, nature-based solutions need to be separated from and additional to decarbonization efforts, not implemented as an alternative to decarbonization. There'd be very little climate gain of even the most ambitious nature-based set of nature-based solutions if we don't manage to eliminate other sources of greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, at the very best, in that scenario, nature-based solutions might introduce a small delay in reaching a given level of climate warming. and it's likely to be a temporary delay, since any carbon that exists in natural systems is in motion and is likely to be lost again as not. Especially as climate changes become more apparent, the rate of disturbance in natural systems is going to increase as well. The natural disturbances, the current rate of human disturbances of natural systems, all of these things make carbon stored on the landscape vulnerable, and so this the likely temporary nature of carbon storage in ecosystems is another reason why it's not the same as avoiding the emissions in the first place. And so I would, from a kind of carbon cycle and climate science point of view, I'd say this separation of nature-based solutions from decarbonizing our energy systems is really key, and it should almost be treated as a separate basket of policy options or potential solutions.
Thank you, Damon. I see Verna is back. Verna, can you hear me properly?
And
okay, great.
Yeah.
So I think everybody would love for you to introduce yourself and just to share some remarks. Welcome you back.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Quay. Hello, bonjour. My name is Verna McGregor, and I'm from Kitagan-Zibi, Anishinaabeg. I have a wide background in doing projects, but working with also First Nations communities, both at the local level and also at the national level. A lot of the national organizations I've worked with, including the National Aboriginal Forestry Association, the AFN. So my strength is from a traditional ecological knowledge, having worked with the communities, and but also bringing that traditional understanding too as well. And I was cut off. I think I have technology problems myself here with my connection, and I apologize for that. Going back to before I left, what I was mentioning is that it was foretold the time we were in here today, and there was a concern about also the road that technology may lead to in terms of also the well-being of the next 7 generations in terms of over-harvesting. And so I was looking at what's the potential benefit of technology. Well, again, too, as well, I see it as more like the mitigation and monitoring, as we already have a number of systems that already monitor. But again, too, as well, how do you include, for example, AI in, for example, impact assessment, environmental assessment, and setting the parameters for that, as also too as well in terms of ongoing monitoring. So I don't know, this is just my initial understandings. I bring also maybe just like a message from my colleague, Roseanne Banshee, who wanted to be here today. She's more of the science-based resource person. And she was mentioning, for example, she gave an example because her research has been on the eastern wolf. And but one of the examples she gave in terms of technology is like the tracking collars that they install on the wolves to track them for their patterns. But it's also technology has been used on the reverse of that. The collars were used to track the wolves so that they may be culled, so that the wolf with the collar leads to the whole pack, and it's easier for them to be hunted. So again, it's just an example of it's not the most like the advanced AI we're talking about. Like these collars have been around for, I don't know, a number of years. But again, too, as well, it's always that framework in mind, and how do you put safeguards as to not to have the abuse and the harm and it is very concerning. And an example too as well, I was just listening in earlier and I was thinking about the car industry, and there's a lot of mention of the electric cars. And again too as well, what the elders say is it's always again to cause and effect. Yes, we want to save the environment by having less fossil fuel, but now we're going to electric. And we see this being on the land with the dams in the environment. So there's only so many hydroelectricity you can derive from the water. So now the flip side to that now in terms of AI, you'll see that the increase in, for example, nuclear is on the horizon as a result of meeting the demand for the electric cars. So is it really an advantage? And I think that's where all you intelligent people, I think that's where it comes to your research is so important in terms of also research in terms of also the impact, the potential impact and analysis of that. Is it really a solution, really? Another, just really quickly I don't want to, I live in Kitigan-Zibi here, and first of all, the Ottawa River watershed has seen one of the highest harvesting of the old growth forest. It was one of the first. And one of the solutions beforehand is silviculture, but we see the impact of the silviculture where the trees are not as healthy. And again, too, they see it as a new technological solutions, but sometimes are they really? And again, that's where, as we're evolving, is sometimes, are we really evolving? And when I look at the silviculture, sometimes I was thinking it's better off that they let the trees or the earth regenerate itself, because nature knows how to regenerate itself. But at the same time, too, as well, we live in a fast-paced society, so we want maximum yield and fast returns, and that's what's driving this AI. And again, how do you balance that? And I speak to as well a lot of times the native understanding and the non-native understanding, and sometimes I guess the biggest challenge is the balance, and that's where your framework comes into as well. Gotcha.
So you mentioned regeneration, and I think this is earlier we've had forest, old growth forest, silviculture, but I'd just like you to mention a bit more around regeneration and the critical views that we need to embrace around regenerations today.
Again, okay, now I'll give you an example too as well. The regeneration now using technology. I said this story in 2015, Ottawa Hydro and with Ontario Hydro came to the community for consultation. And it was for the upgrading of the Chaudière Dam on the Ottawa River. And when they came in, one of the things the elders here have been saying for the last 40 years, even longer, is when they built that dam in 1904, there was no environmental assessment and there was no monitoring system too, but they saw it themselves firsthand how the American eel was basically wiped out. It was 99% just wiped out of the river. And so what happened there is, so when they came into the community in 2015, and it was because of this, the Supreme Court rulings on the duty to consult. So they saw it as more like, oh, it's part of the process. Let's go do our due diligence and consult. So when we were in the meeting, we mentioned the eels, and I said, is there a way that you could, I know it's not very practical these days to remove the dam because of the population that has grown around the dam, and then you're going to be disturbing the ecosystem once again. Can you install, for example, I said they have technology now like a fish elevator. Can you install a fish elevator and maybe start the research in terms of maybe that may bring back the species? So what happened is I didn't hear from them. They left, and about 2 years later, we were called back to a meeting, and they had the engineer get up and do a presentation, and she was talking about doing the research on the American eel, and as a result of that, they did install a fish elevator in the upgrading of the dam. And her research, she goes, it was so close to my heart because she goes, they were like my babies. And I said, oh, there's the female understanding. But also, they augmented, because of research, they augmented the grade on the dam so that the baby eels can pass through. So again, I think that's an example of mitigation where the city of Ottawa still needs the hydro for the city, but at the same time, it's bringing back also the species that what the damage was done when the dam was initially built. So I think too, as well as we're looking at parameters, it's always looking to as well as how do we see the vision of a win-win solution to using technology, but also at the same time, how do we install parameters? And they went even further, though. I found out about a month ago that they put a glass walkway over the fish elevator. So I guess you can walk over and check out the fish. That's a monitoring system too, I guess. But again, that's how do we open our minds and with this technology in a good way.
Thank you, Verna. And you just mentioned something that we actually have not mentioned at all, is a gendered perspective around this. And before I open it up for everybody for last remarks, I just would like to hear from you in terms of what are ways do we need to open up to a gendered perspectives as we look at nature-based solutions and action plan going forward?
Well, I always think too as well, again, what is consultation? And consultation is also the gender-based perspective. And we always said that too as well. Diversity starts basically with the also male, female, and all our relatives in between, the LGBTQ, because they have their own perspective too. And everybody has their own perspective. And consultation, when you put your minds together too as well, like you're doing today, it's amazing the innovation that may come from it, but we always fear change and left field ideas, but sometimes too as well, that's what you need to as well to move things forward. And if you look at too as well, we're coming from going back to the biggest clash in understanding with this colonialism and the newcomers coming to our land was that of the role of women. And now we're playing catch up. And that's one of the prophecies too as well, is the rise in women to bring back that balance. And when I was talking about the female engineer working on the eels, she brought a different perspective as a mother, and the importance of also the nurturing of the species, as opposed to sometimes it's only seen as an economic good. But maybe sometimes this diversified perspective brings this understanding of the interconnection of everything.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Verna. So we're going to start wrapping up. Go ahead. Did anybody? I heard something. Okay. Just wanted to say we're wrapping up. We have about 16 minutes left, and I just wanted to give each one of you an opportunity to have some closing remarks to really, in terms of anything you'd like to share. I'd like to give each of you about 3 minutes around Canada's sustainable future. What are your wishes based on your expertise? What would you like to see happen specifically in the next 9 years?
Maybe I can
jump.
go first.
Please, Damon.
Well, I have to leave a few minutes before 4, so I mean, I'm going to speak from a climate science perspective because that's what I know. I mean, again, Canada has set a net zero target for 2050, has committed to decrease emissions by, I think, 45% by 2030. I mean, I would like to see stronger targets. I mean, I think it's still the case that Canada's emissions target is not representative of a really fair level of effort, particularly if we're wanting to meet the most ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement. I mean, I think nature and ecosystems have a role to play in supporting that underlying climate goal. But again, it's not the most important lever to actually meet our climate targets. Natural systems can play a supporting role, and we can land or redefine how we're using natural systems and interacting with natural systems in a way that would help bring us towards our climate goals. But I honestly, I think there are probably better reasons to implement nature-based solutions than to meet our climate goals. I think if all we focus on is climate goals, then that has a danger of actually leading to kind of perverse applications of nature-based solutions that prioritize carbon above all else, and that we would actually lose in the big picture of wanting to kind of support natural systems and communities that depend on those systems, including Indigenous communities. And so I would say, placing the climate goals and the carbon benefits of nature-based solutions as one piece of the puzzle, and probably not even the most important piece. And if we do that, then to solve the climate problem, we really need to focus on the big issues, which is the energy system and the decarbonization efforts that need to go along with that. And in parallel, we need to redefine our relationship with nature and make Canada a better place because of it, and not use those solutions as a way of justifying continued extraction and distracting from the big important levers on the climate side.
I can jump in. I very much second what Damon said, and I would continue in that vein by saying that I think, in particular, thinking about the what could be called co-benefits of ecosystem services, though this is a rather contractual way of talking about benefits to the world and benefits to organisms other than humans. But even from a purely humanity-centric perspective, remembering that nature-based solutions engage with, to the extent to which interventions are optimizing for carbon, it can lead us to neglect the extent to which they affect many other things. And that can be impact on species, on ecosystem services, on more complicated pathways involving carbon that we haven't fully mapped out yet. If we are purely optimizing for most carbon stored, that maybe the best way to do that is to destroy all the current ecosystems and grow some extremely fast growing plant that will sequester lots of carbon. I don't think that would actually be the case. But if that were the case, then we still shouldn't do it. Somewhat clearly. And so really remembering that we are trying to optimize from multiple objectives here, and thinking about it through the lens of carbon is really, it's just one. I think that that would be the point I would leave with. I'll hand it over to the other panelists now.
Paul?
Well, I agree 100% with what was said, and I will begin with a caveat, just by saying that we should not allow nature-based solutions, this umbrella, to become an escape or an excuse for anything to go on. There's just no time, and there's no space for that. So it should not become the wiggle space for other things not to happen. This is the risk. So this is the risk that I think we collectively have to avoid. And so we need to decarbonize, and it's not going to happen through this. It has to happen through other ways. And this cannot become an excuse or the wiggle room or a way out or for others not to do their job. So I think this is, to me, one, and I paraphrase Damien. Having said that, I think the positive side of it, which is what I think we have tried to focus on, is the framework of mind of saying this becomes a framework of working towards of improving the state of our environment, and improving and righting the wrongs, the environmental wrongs and the human wrongs as well. They actually go together in many ways. And I think I would say that if, in order to implement a framework like this, it has to be science-based. It has to be science-based, but it also has to include indigenous knowledge, in the sense that these things cannot be detached one from the other, and it has to include the people who are living in the different places. So it has to be factual based, but it has to also include indigenous knowledge, because which is factual, it has its own structure. We have to learn how to combine these structures of knowledge so that they are more effectively used. And we cannot let, and it has to have outcomes that can be actually measured or quantified, because it's okay to say we are going to implement solutions, but there has to be, these solutions have to come with outcomes that we can actually be able to assess in a way that there are outcomes, and there are people responsible for those outcomes, and there are good and bad outcomes, so that we can judge the results of what we've done. So I would say that those are my points, and I am favorable to the idea, because I think it's not one particular nature-based solution that I have in mind. It's not forestry, it's not planting trees. It's about a change of framework, saying there is another way of acting that includes the ecosystem, that includes the people in it, that includes the knowledge of the people in it. And I think that's what, in my mind, counts.
Thank you. Verna, if you can close us off in terms of what should we be holding as we think of 7 generations down the line? What can we be there for them in terms of in our lives?
I think it's again, it's revisiting why we lived the way we did. And it was always about the understanding of the next 7 generations, And I remember my brother telling us this too as well, is that, you know, our understanding too even goes down to religion, not to be disrespectful, but, you know, man is at the top here, and then it's the dominance over nature. And that's what technology wants to do sometimes. It's that dominance over nature. The native understanding is flipped over, in that because we weren't created, we haven't been here that long. We were created last, but we were also gifted with sharp minds, knowledge, and reason. And because of that, we have a bigger responsibility to look after what we do and what we do to the environment. And that's the biggest thing, is also responsibility. It's like having children. You don't you have to put your boundaries in terms of also where you cross the line in terms of abuse. That's because we have the knowledge and understanding that, and the our inner guidance and our inner will. So, and an example, as I was saying at one time, is also like we here as Algonquin, we know we were dependent on the wildlife game. Well, the coming of the newcomers, it was the animal husbandry, which helped the population have more of a secure food source too, as well. But now how do you know when you've crossed that limit? When you have commercial farming that leads to this carbonization and the methane. And I think that's where the role of science comes into as well. And on that note, yeah, it's my two cents. And if you want, I'll do a close for you after.
Please. I'm just going to say thank you, everyone. I will let Verna close for us, and then I will end this presentation.
Okay, I'm going to sing you a little song, and it's called, what I'm saying is that Anishinaabe really is like the people. And I'm saying, we are the people, we love the land, we're good workers, and we're good hunters, really, for us. Then I put it in modern context is, we are the people, we love the land, we become good writers and good readers or researchers. So that's what I'm singing. But it's also a reminder that we also, it's our own personal responsibility to why we're here. So it goes like this. Nishnabek inawin sayageton nindakinan yenita anokimen yenita odamtamen. Hey ya hey, hey ya hey, hey ya hey ya hey ya ho, hey ya hey, hey ya ho, hey ya hey ya hey ya ho. Anishinaabe kinawin sayageton nindakinan yenita nabotigamen yenita oshibigamen. Hey ya hey, hey ya hey, hey ya hey ya hey ya ho. Hey ya hey, hey ya ho, hey ya hey ya hey ya ho. What it says too as well is, as you all use your mind too as well, don't forget about your heart, and that brings your understanding, and it's always about balance. That's my words for the day. And don't stay in your minds too much, scientists. We love you, but don't forget your heart too.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the CSPC conference. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.